So essentially, the questions you have about React Native, just raise your hand and we will forward the questions to Mike. And if you don't have any questions, I'll just ask a few questions on the top of my head.
This may be a simple question, or it depends on the current state of any libraries. I would like to know if you have some experience with sharing code between React Native and a typical web application. I know the native base and found a native base web in the meantime. Sounds interesting.
Okay, so actually I can immediately sort of stuff. All right, so in terms of universal code, like the first time React Native came out, we didn't really have a lot of requests for that, but it's been changing, and recently almost all the apps that we do, people want actually to share the code. So there are quite a few things that we share, with the first one being obviously the business logic, which you know, there is nothing really crazy about it. It's JavaScript, so there is nothing really special that you have to do. The other thing which is more interesting is the components and the views and layouts that we share. So anything that is like a higher order component and stuff, that's also quite simple. In terms of sharing other stuff, like that really depends. In terms of like going from the top of the app, we don't share navigation and we don't share containers, because like if you start sharing from the very top, you will end up creating an app that will have a degraded user experience, in my opinion. Because, like, for example, if you use React Router that can run on React Native, or React Navigation that can run on native and on web, none of these will be actually looking good on either of platforms, simply because React Navigation doesn't have React Router features, and React Router doesn't have React Navigation animations. So our idea is to use actually separate entry points for each of the target, and it especially makes sense on universal Windows platform, where, for example, clients that we have are experimenting with, like within Windows, there can be like hundreds of different input devices and navigations. So that's a place where it gets even complicated. So from a technical point of view, the way we do it is we use Webpack obviously for that, instead of the built-in React Native packager that doesn't handle the universal code sharing. So that's the first and the biggest, let's say, barrier to set it up, because that's not non-standard and actually requires a bit of knowledge of how Webpack works internally. Once we set it up, we basically start from the leaf components. So we have this shared thing where we put things that possibly make sense to be shared across platforms, like buttons, and then, let's say, I would call these primitives that are building our app. And then we go up and up just to see whether it makes sense to share it. Obviously, if you compare, I don't know, the dashboard that you might have on web with dashboard that you might have on mobile, these are so fundamentally different that rather than sharing simple building blocks, it doesn't really make sense to share like layouts, the top level layout, because the web will have a completely different layout, including like nested divs and tables and scroll views, whereas mobile will be more sort of a simple UI with like a tab bar, right? So the point is that, like from my point of view, the sharing, like we always start with sharing the business logic and the smallest parts of the app. And then as we go deeper, we basically check and sort of diff the platforms as we go deeper, just to see what kind of paths of our code can be possibly decoupled and deduplicated by creating a shared implementation that runs on all these platforms.
Next question.
A small addition to the previous question, do you share CSS code?
So we don't actually, like if it's a shareable component, we use like an abstraction over CSS and styles in React Native that actually can be shared. So it can be, for example, style from React Native. Like not getting into details of what particular library we are using, because it can be even style components or whatever you want. So that makes sense for the low-level building blocks, but as the other stuff, like we don't really dive deep into that. In terms of constants and theming, we have our like very simple in-house made higher order component with context and some constants. So that is like an obvious thing to share that we can have on both platforms. But we don't go, that deep, and we don't go crazy, and we don't write CSS on native and stuff like that. That's not what we do. Just try to kind of make part of the component that's shared, make it styled shareable as well, where it makes sense.
More questions?
About 8 months ago, when I started with the React Native, when there would be coming new versions, the backwards compatibility has always been a problem. It wouldn't be compatible anymore. On Android it would work, iOS it wouldn't work, and then when you use a lot of third-party libraries, they would not be compatible anymore. And then after 1 or 2 days, they would catch up, make a new npm, and etc. How has that been from the React Native side, from your side, coping with that? And it has improved tremendously over the time, but
yeah, sure. So that is a very interesting topic to discuss, and there are a lot of reasons that contribute to the state where we are. One of the reasons for this is that, like many people ask me why React doesn't have this issue, and React Native does. The biggest difference is that in terms of Facebook is using React version that they have on GitHub, right? So they have their own copy, as far as I'm aware, I guess, that diverges from the open source version. Whereas with React Native, they have their own copy. The open source is a copy, right? So they have internal version that is kind of leading the development, that is always ahead of what we have. And what happens later is that the commits that they do internally get backported to GitHub that we have. And the problem here is that when they backport it, the mechanism that does it, it doesn't actually check with our tests, for example. So many times, including this release cycle, the CI has been broken for like 2 weeks just because someone landed a pull request internally that didn't break tests for them because they have a different pipeline, but did break our tests. And that will break for you as well. And it's not only about breaking, but it's also about kind of trying to understand why this particular breaking change has been shipped. Because of the fact that they are kind of ahead of us, it's tricky to be updated on all the motivations that they have internally as far as implementing features. So that's the first issue. We are trying to fix it, currently discussing with Facebook how we could improve it. Few people suggested that there should be a fork sort of community that is, all the commits are checked. It's probably not the best idea, and no one's gonna do it, but it's just, showing the case that we are trying to solve it. And that's also what I do when I cut the release branch and the tests are failing. I sometimes just kind of revert a few of the commits that are just hard to understand why they are breaking stuff. But the biggest problem, which also kind of answers what you said about libraries catching up, is that we used to have this bi-monthly release cycle where we were releasing 2 versions a month. And a lot of people were complaining that it's just too fast. It's just too much, they can't actually keep up with the velocity, they have to keep upgrading. The thing is, I've been always saying this to people, if you don't have to upgrade, don't do it. I've been creating apps on React 0.40 where the master was 46. And I was like, I'm gonna do it when I'm done. Problem is, when we slow the velocity and do it once a month, the problem is even worse because no one is running the release candidates. Have you ever used RC? Probably not, maybe just a few people. And if that happens, how we are supposed to catch the issues? Which unfortunately means that when I get RC for a month, and at the end of the month I'm gonna promote it to stable, I usually do it when I go to sleep. I'm gonna wake up with hundreds of issues, because that's the moment when people are gonna upgrade it, because that's the default right now, that's the latest. And everyone is like, oh, why did it break? So that's another problem, that we have to sort of fix the beta channel and make it in a way that others can test. There are a few ways we are working on it. One of them is being create integration tests that are gonna be sort of stable and less flaky. Right now we are integration testing Android, And we have basic screenshot tests on iOS to avoid glitches within the CSS part of React Native. But what we are missing is the way to actually launch the app and test a variety of interactions like timeouts that can break. We are planning to use Detox for that by Wix, which is a great library that you also can facilitate within your app. And then we are planning to use it on a cloud service provider, which after today's talk could be AWS, we'll see. But the thing is that we are planning to do it in the cloud so that it's more stable and easier for people to contribute test suites as well. But it's kind of tricky, and again, like from my perspective, the biggest issue is that React Native is not entirely an open source framework. Like, it is in open source, but it's worth remembering that still the issues and features that are being done and pushed out there are just a copy of what Facebook is doing for their business perspective. And just like for me and for them, many things will work. Just like for me, animated API will be okay. For others in the open source, will not be. And the thing is that none of us will have actually interest in fixing that because, you know, works for me kind of thing, and busyness. And that's why we need people to sort of step up and take care of these issues. Otherwise, we end up in that sort of confusing state where we are not really sure what's the future of the framework and how to actually fix these issues that keep adding up over time. Because, again, works for me, but you have a different use case, and yeah, that's how it kind of works.
More questions?
You just kind of already touched on this briefly, like the future of React Native. How do you see the future of React Native? And you just described some problems that don't really sound good, to be honest, and sound like it could really slow down the progress and the project eventually. So how do you see the future?
So I just came back from a SF where I met a lot of React Native users. The good thing is that a lot of big enterprises are invested into React Native. Obviously, they won't tell you this because NDAs and everyone, in SF is kind of crazy about their internal technology and what they use. So not everyone is super transparent about using React Native. But I've met with a lot of people, and the general attitude is to sort of fix this problem as soon as possible by creating a sort of, like a committee sort of thing that will be taking care of that. Right now we have these monthly meetings where the biggest users of React Native are meeting to discuss the progress. And I know it may sound scary that there are a lot of issues and maybe people will just abandon it, or what will happen if Facebook does it. But there are a lot of companies that I know that are invested into it, and I think that the fact that, for example, at Amazon, that there is React Native integration, it kind of shows the fact that there is certain enterprise adoption that's sort of in the air, and that's also one of the reasons why these companies are adding this support, including Microsoft that has a lot of enterprise customers that they're also looking for React Native. So it will be fixed eventually. Like I'm very positive about it. Like I know it's bad, and sometimes I'm also freaking out, like having this red screen for a week, and I don't really know why. But in case of that player that I was talking about, like if it wasn't for React Native, we probably wouldn't do it. But we were able to ship it, and I agree, I had to cut out a lot of features and do a lot of workarounds to avoid glitches and like trying to understand why the baseline of text is different on both platforms. But eventually, it got me there, and I launched the app. So it's just that we have to improve the governance of the framework itself. Maybe learn from other communities and see how it goes. Flutter is a great example of how a nice community can be managed. I've heard that they have a special person hired in the team just to take care of the general policy within the issues. So we'll see, but that's something that will be solved. At least there will be an attempt to solve it in the coming days, in the coming months. So I'm quite positive about that.
Next question.
I would be interested in how App Sync will work for us as a developer, because sometimes I'm sitting in a train, have a low, bad network. We were talking about offline supports, but can I also do it without connected to the cloud, without Amazon services, just on my development machine?
Short version is not in the near future.
One more React Native question. So I've worked with React Native for like 1.5 years, and my impression is the same. Like, it's not like React. It's not so well adopted. It's not so well maintained or backed by Facebook. On the other hand, having seen Netscape Navigator, the phase where there was no overarching APIs or something where you could develop for the desktop, which is now the web essentially. I see the same thing doing, React Native is doing the same thing. It's a very early phase where we will get some abstraction above the native APIs. Do you think React Native will be the future for this? Will this be something that can be standardized, where you say this is a layer that you can develop for the web and for the mobile systems in a nice and performant way? Is there any sort of standardization in progress? Any ideas about that? Or is this something more like PWA or Flutter in that direction?
So there is no standardization that I'm aware going on right now. In terms of the future, it's like, it's hard to predict. I'm kind of torn between React Native and other like frameworks, with Kotlin Native and Flutter being the most two that I'm exploring. We at Callstack are going to launch, we're going to try to get at least one project within each of these technologies next year, just to keep an eye on where we're going, because they definitely have a lot of their benefits. At least Flutter is way more, close to stability than Kotlin, so that's probably what we'll start with. But like, React Native wasn't the first one to bring this concept of cross-platform code and stuff. It's just that it like, as I said, like for me it became so popular because of JS velocity and our general community attitude that there is a new framework, we all get on board, we all talk about it, and obviously React that made this cross-platform abilities. So it all depends. Like, in terms of progressive web apps, this has been brought up a lot of times, and like right now my biggest concern, I might be wrong because I haven't been playing around in that field, is that I kind of don't feel like the DOM itself can be kind of fast enough for these interactions that I've seen on my slides. But if someone can impress me with that animation that is gesture driven, I'll be more than happy to say that's also a good solution. But again, as I said, like for me, rather than asking which framework is better, let's better focus which one is better suited for that particular job and which one will get us there. Because if you are launching a brand new product, you don't have React at all anywhere, and you don't want to share code between platforms, then why don't you just go and do it natively, right? Like, that's one of the things that you also should answer yourself, depending on the availability of developers, your team expertise, and stuff like that. You can use, I don't know, you have Xamarin, for example, you have Swift also has the cross-platform framework that just popped up quite a few weeks ago that I've discovered. So I'm not like super committed to React Native. I love it and I love the community and I do a lot within it. But if I find like a better alternative one day, I'll probably check it out because, as I said, like the future is somewhere there, but I'm not sure if it's going to be JavaScript. It really depends on where we go in the upcoming years.
Next question would be, essentially I see the problem, and like in both your talks, you talked about the bridge. JavaScript is very fast, native code is even faster, but the bridge is very slow, it's single-threaded and so on. Are there any plans to fix this issue, or is it just something that can't be really addressed within JavaScript?
Well, you can have two bridges. So, like, most of the performance optimizations that I'm aware of that happen to limitate the amount of traffic over the bridge. With, for example, native animations being one of the ways to do it, because you send the payload once and then you forget about it. Or with optimizations like lazy initialization of native modules, or optimizing the payload that you transfer through the bridge instead of, for example, like complex data structures, you transfer primitives. Like, I'm not sure if you know, but stylesheet.create returns you a number, and that number is passed through the bridge rather than the object of your styles, just to optimize the payload. So there is nothing that we can fix about it. It's just the limitation of the framework that we have to cope with. So like when we are talking about performance optimizations, it's not just because React Native is slow, it's just because the paradigm that we are using has its benefits for universal code and for JS, expressiveness and JS tools, but it also has this breach that is just a downside that we have to live with, that makes this JS communication possible. So you can't get rid of it, but you can make a synchronous call through the bridge if you need. Not that I'm recommending that, but it's not that it's always async, right? So yeah, as I said, like performance-wise, you just have to think of, like profile and see what's the traffic you have over the bridge, and see what are the ways you can limit that if it's causing you troubles. Because if it's not, then it's okay. In reality, it has a lot of capacity, and like the most important things are, the UI thread related calls. So if you have like update view call happening through the bridge, you most likely want this one to be prioritized, whereas your API call can wait like a few ticks because it's not required to happen at the time of the call. So that's the place where you can optimize that, and there are ways to do it natively right now. Unfortunately not documented, but there are ways to do it. And hopefully, like with new release of React being added to React Native, there will be more clever way to sort of orchestrate, the importance of the changes and the order they're getting passed to the bridge. Because right now, I'm not really sure if that's organized in any way rather than just first in, first out. Yep.
So I've been doing with the React Native stuff, with the React Native framework, not an actual application, but rather trying to use it in a framework, which then gets integrated into the app. So I have noticed that with that task, I really need a lot of not only JS expertise, but also mobile expertise, the native one, plus the bridge, the knowledge of how the bridge works, the threading, the C++, and also getting into the Gradle and all the kinds of packaging systems. So my question is, when building, for example, the app with the media player, the scores, how much mobile, how much native expertise did you use, and did you need in order to create such an application, for example?
All right. So quite a lot. So like that's true that with React Native you gotta use like a lot of languages, with Objective-C or Swift being one of them, and on Android obviously you have Java or Kotlin depending on your choice, and Gradle, which can be very, very depressing sometimes, and Cocopods on iOS, which is also the same. But like when I was watching one of the conference talks that I watched from ReactConf by James Ida, who's a great contributor to React Native and now on Expo team, he said he had this talk on actually working with React Native and how does it look like from the management perspective, where he talked that rather than being a full stack developer with React Native, you are more likely a cross-stack engineer because you work across different sort of paradigms. And that's true that in order to launch the app that will be polished more than 80%, you gotta do native code. whether it's just doing little touches to the native side or doing native modules. That's why I don't believe that, you know, apps like create React Native app, like my personal opinion is that I don't think that it's good for enterprise, because every app that I had to build had to do native module. The player one was native code, and when I eject from create React Native app, I end up with like the framework that I don't understand because I didn't make it and it's not React Native. It's just another layer of abstraction, which is great because that's Expo SDK, but that's just another abstraction. Anyway, the point is that, for example, in case of the player, that required a lot of knowledge, and it's probably a bad example because the player itself had to be super optimized. So on Android,
That's a good example, actually.
so I can give you a few interesting also differences between platforms, because on iOS this player has 3 tracks with like 4 voices, and each track can play, like all the music has to play at the same time, right? So I get like 4 MP3s and I gotta play them at the same time. So with iOS I can just pass an array of songs to player and hit start, easy, right? Android is not the same. You can't pass an array. Okay, so then you start digging and you have 2 options. Decode MP3 to like stream and manually merge it. I'm like, what? Like, do I really need to understand what's PCM, these numbers? And honestly, one of the answers was to merge like numbers by numbers, which is just too much for me. So the other was create 5 media player objects and control each of them. And now the problem is the start call is synchronous and it's blocking. So I can't call them all at the same time. It's like, when I'm doing that, the first iteration of the app was like killing my ears because every track was like off by a second, you know? And then obviously you gotta get crashes on Samsung devices because each media player requires some sort of a codec on the CPU, whatever. And not every architecture can give you up to 4 because sometimes it's just 2. So the point is that on this one we spent like 3 months. I spent fixing this and understanding how to do it. And at some point I was like, maybe we're just gonna fail. But luckily we did it. And one of the coolest optimizations that we had there was that when I set this on progress event 60 times per second, in order to do this, this kind of fluid animation, when you send an event from native side to React Native, there is undocumented way to specify the order your callback is getting sent to JS. Think of it that the React Native on Android has the cycle that every event loop goes through 6 steps. The first one is the UI thread callbacks, then there is animations, then there is native modules, and at the end is your JavaScript logic, right? So if you know this, you can tell React Native to sort of change the order in a way that the JS code will run before the thread, before the UI, right? So that, for example, can give you 1 frame more, because if you update your animation logic in JS thread, which happens at the end, then you have to wait for another tick for the UI thread to pick that update up. So you can kind of shift things around, but it's like, I like it because I like native development, so that's one of the reasons I like doing that stuff. But my friends on team are so like, they are raging sometimes that like this like they have to do navigation and they have to do native stuff, and they're like, for example, one of my friends, which is also like very like he contributes a lot to React Native itself. He's like, one day I'm gonna get back to writing Android natively, because you know he has these days of depression that nothing works. But I will look at it from a different perspective. Don't be upset or scared of the fact that you have to write native code. Think of it as an opportunity, because many times you want to learn new stack and you don't have time, right? Like I keep telling myself I'm gonna learn Haskell. I do it for 2 months, then I leave, and it repeats for at least 1 year. But with React Native, I don't have a choice, because if they ask me to do it, I gotta learn Objective-C, I gotta learn Kotlin, and I have to deliver that. So that allowed me to learn Android development, for example. If it wasn't for React Native, I would be just iOS developer. Right now I have a bit of Android knowledge thanks to these issues. So, think positively about it and like opportunity everywhere.
Did you use TypeScript or any TypeScript or Flow, basically?
So we use Flow everywhere on
Okay.
all the projects.
Okay. Would you recommend not using either for React Native projects?
I would recommend that you stick to Flow just because React Native itself has Flow. So that gives you a good starting point. Flow issues itself are another topic to discuss. And one of the issues that, for example, stops myself from fixing Flow issues is that it's written in OCaml. And when they were teaching me OCaml at the university, I was absent. Like half of my colleagues from functional programming class because we were all OP by then. But that's what I would choose. I like it more than TypeScript because it allows me to gradually adapt it across my code. I can just use it within one file and I can get type checking right away rather than kind of convert my entire code base. Not sure how's TypeScript right now, but that was the case back in the day.
You can do the same thing now.
Oh,
Yeah, Amazon uses TypeScript internally for just about all of its projects now.
have you checked Flow?
Yes, they did. It got rejected in favor of TypeScript.
Why?
I have no idea. I wasn't making the decision.
Some decisions just happen.
Yeah.
All right, so maybe one more question from my side. JavaScript just got a new brother called WebAssembly. Essentially, the opportunity I see there is to get better performance. Like, for example, the bridge issues, stuff like this could be solved, and multi-threading, that you can actually script multi-threaded. Has the React Native core team looked at WebAssembly yet? Any opinions about this?
So, WebAssembly itself, I gotta say, I kind of have limited capacity of absorbing new things, so didn't read a lot about its latest things. However, with React Native, like, even if you would sort of optimize the bridge, the problem is at the level where it connects into, like, the JS that you have runs inside JS core, which is what iOS uses for Swift, for Safari. And as you know, you can't get your own implementation on iOS, you have to stick to that one. And the thing is that this implementation has these callbacks that allow you to actually communicate between JS and native. Same if you use Safari web view in your app, you also have the ability to actually send a message and receive it. So that's the pain point. You can't multi-thread that one because that's the framework level thing. As far as I'm aware of the implementation, because it could have changed. One interesting concept that I've heard of people are exploring is the ability to first thing update JS core on Android, and then when the versions are the same, the idea is to actually sort of pre-bundle React Native bundles in a way that they would be already sort of parsed by the VM. So rather than shipping JS code that has to be parsed, the idea is that JS core can accept the binary bundle that has been already passed these steps, which can increase, for example, startup performance by a second. But that's not a solution to the bridge itself. Honestly, it wasn't a problem for me. Like, bridge wasn't the issue. In most cases, when the bridge was slowing down, it was just me doing too much. So that was a good moment to reflect on what I did and what I can do to improve it, and maybe what I can offload as well.
I mean, there's a good point there of the way that you utilize the bridge. Our original implementation of those cryptographic libraries was, let's shove everything across the bridge, and hundreds and thousands of calculations going across, and that clogged up the bridge. And it's just pure mechanics at that point. It's single-threaded. You're going to bump into those issues, particularly when you have to wait for certain calculations to come back before you can kick off the next one. So there are always going to be those bottlenecks. What's important is really to identify those bottlenecks and decide which side of the bridge you want to be on when you're doing that. The answer is the native side, most of the time, but not all the time. Sometimes you can be a bit more intelligent about the algorithms you put on the JavaScript side. So it's one of those classic software engineering problems that get people to scratch their heads and then feel really good when they've solved it.
Questions still? So I think we have to wrap up at this point because we have like 20 minutes to leave here. So
One thing regarding the breach and too many messages that we tried doing on the workshop recently is we had a component that was displaying a graph of calls that happened through that breach. And so obviously that's a lot of things that has to be transferred, just like you said. So we decided to create a second native React Native instance with its own breach and sync natively these two breaches, and then just so the breach that was busy was the secondary one that I created just for the sake of showing the graph, right? The original one that was being spied for the calls didn't even know it's spied because we spied on the native side. So again, hacks, but
Did you publish something about that? Did you publish something about it?
Not yet. I mean, we just did it like 2 days ago. If that's worth sharing and you feel like you would like to humor about it, I'll be more than happy to write it. Maybe just like a demo on how to do it. No problems. I'm gonna save it to my...
all right, thanks for coming to Munich, to Mike, and also to Amazon and Adrian for the great introduction about AWS Amplify and of course App Sync, which is also quite interesting and quite new. And yeah, thanks for coming and have a nice evening.
Thank you.